In the final years of World War II, Japan stood cornered. The mighty empire that once roared across the Pacific was now reeling under the relentless advance of American forces. One island after another fell to the Allies, and the once invincible Imperial Navy had been shattered. American bombers darkened Japan's skies, cities burned, and the noose around the homeland tightened. The war was slipping away. Yet, out of this desperation emerged one of the most audacious naval projects in history. The I-400 Class Submarines. Unlike any vessel seen before, these were not simple submarines. They were underwater aircraft carriers, massive leviathans built to deliver a knockout blow to the United States at a time when Japan needed a miracle. The concept itself was revolutionary. Create a submarine capable of traveling across the globe undetected, surfacing close to enemy shores, and launching aircraft for devastating surprise attacks. This idea would bypass the American naval blockade, outwit their defenses, and strike where they least expected. It was a gamble, but for Japan, it was perhaps the only chance left to change the course of the war. At the heart of this vision was a daring plan: destroy the Panama Canal. This vital waterway was the lifeline of the United States, allowing its navy to move warships quickly between the Atlantic and Pacific. Crippling it would force the Americans to sail thousands of miles around South America, buying Japan precious time to regroup and strengthen its defenses. The I-400 submarines were built to make this plan a reality. Measuring over 400 feet in length and with an astonishing range of 37,000 miles without refueling, these vessels were engineering masterpieces. They were nearly twice the size of any submarine in the world at that time. Inside their massive hulls, they carried 3 specially designed Ciron bombers, folded neatly inside a watertight hangar. These aircraft were no ordinary planes. Their wings folded, their floats detached, all to save space. When the submarine surfaced, the bombers could be assembled, armed, and launched via a catapult in mere minutes. The plan was simple but bold: appear from the depths, unleash a deadly airstrike, and vanish back into the ocean before the enemy could react. Japan intended to build dozens of these submarines, enough to terrorize American shores and strategic assets. But war is cruel to even the most brilliant plans. The Allied advance was too fast, resources too scarce, and time too short. In the end, only 3 I-400 class submarines were completed. By the time they were ready for action, the war had shifted dramatically. The United States had captured critical islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, bringing their bombers within range of Japan itself. American naval power was overwhelming, and their skies were filled with planes. The Panama Canal mission, once Japan's bold hope, was abandoned as impossible. Instead, a new target was chosen: Ulithi Atoll, a remote lagoon in the Pacific that served as a crucial staging area for the U.S. fleet. Their aircraft carriers, battleships, and supply vessels gathered in preparation for the final assault on Japan. A successful attack on Ulithi could delay the invasion and give Japan one last chance to negotiate from a position of strength. The I-400 submarines, armed with their Ciron bombers, set out for what would be their only combat mission. Every man on board knew the stakes. They carried the weight of Japan's last hope on their shoulders. If they succeeded, they could change the course of history, if only for a moment. But fate was not on their side. By the time the submarines neared their destination, the American fleet had already dispersed. The element of surprise was gone. The target vanished, and the mission was called off. What was meant to be Japan's ultimate counterstrike ended without a single shot fired. From that point on, the I-400 class submarines had no role left to play. The war was collapsing around them. The United States had total control of the seas, the skies, and soon, Japan itself. In this grim reality, these underwater giants became relics even before they saw battle. Magnificent weapons built for a war that had already been lost. As Japan's empire crumbled and its cities burned, the I-400 class submarines sailed into the vast Pacific on a mission that no longer had a clear objective. They had been designed to strike fear deep into enemy territory, but now they were wandering in the shadows of defeat. Their commanders knew that time was running out, and every mile they traveled brought them closer to a confrontation they might not survive. While the Japanese hoped to use these vessels to deliver one last devastating blow, the Americans were already closing in. By mid-1945, U.S. intelligence had become highly sophisticated. The Allies had broken Japanese codes, intercepted communications, and pieced together fragments of information, hinting at a mysterious new weapon. enormous submarines with capabilities far beyond anything the world had seen. Reports suggested these vessels could carry aircraft and launch attacks from places no one thought possible. To the Americans, this was alarming. Even in its final days, Japan had proven it was capable of shocking surprises, from kamikaze attacks to secret weapons. The idea that these submarines could slip through the ocean and strike American bases or even the mainland made finding them a top priority. Hunting the I-400s, however, was no easy task. Unlike conventional submarines, they could travel 37,000 miles without refueling and carry vast stores of supplies, enabling them to stay submerged for weeks, far from Japanese waters. Their sheer size allowed them to roam the Pacific like silent predators, choosing when and where to appear. But by this stage of the war, the U.S. Navy had perfected the art of anti-submarine warfare, using cutting-edge sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, and aggressive search patterns. American destroyers swept suspected areas relentlessly. The ocean became a deadly chessboard, and the I-400s were the pieces the Americans were determined to capture. For the crews aboard these submarines, life became a nerve-straining game of survival. The deep waters were their only shield, yet they knew that sonar could still find them. They executed sharp, evasive turns, altered depths, and used every trick to avoid detection. Inside the steel hulls, tension was unbearable. Every distant ping of sonar, every distant explosion of depth charges sent shivers through their bones. When the Americans finally closed in, the hunt turned deadly. Destroyers unleashed relentless barrages of depth charges, the ocean exploding around the submarines. Inside, Japanese sailors clung to their stations as shockwaves rattled the walls and the crushing water pressure threatened to rip the vessels apart. They dove deeper, hoping to escape, but the noose was tightening. The commanders of the I-400s faced a terrible choice: fight to the death or surrender. For decades, the Imperial Navy had taught its men that surrender was dishonorable. Yet at this point, honor offered nothing but a cold grave at the bottom of the sea. Choosing life over a futile death, they ordered the submarines to surface. When the massive vessels broke through the waves, American sailors stared in disbelief. These were not ordinary submarines. They were giants, unlike anything they had ever seen. Rising from the ocean like beasts from a forgotten world, they dwarfed the American destroyers. The Japanese crews, exhausted and wearing tattered uniforms, climbed onto the decks with hands raised. The once secret weapons of the Empire had fallen into enemy hands without ever firing a shot. The Americans quickly boarded and secured the vessels, astonished at what they had captured. For them, this was not just a battlefield victory. It was an intelligence windfall. Naval engineers and military experts swarmed over the captured submarines, eager to uncover their secrets. The size alone was astonishing, but what truly fascinated them was the technology hidden within: the aircraft hangar, the catapult launch system, the folding wing bombers, and the advanced engineering that allowed these vessels to travel across oceans undetected. As the submarines were towed away under American control, the Japanese sailors were taken as prisoners of war. For them, the mission was over. They had failed to strike the enemy, failed to change the tide, and now their proud vessels were trophies for the very navy they were meant to destroy. In Japan, the news of their capture spread like a shockwave. Military leaders, already facing the reality of impending defeat, saw this as another crushing blow. These submarines had been symbols of hope, the last trump card in a losing game. Their loss without even a single successful attack was humiliating. It was clear now that Japan's military strength had been broken beyond repair. On the American side, the excitement over the captured submarines was immense. Experts studied every inch of these underwater giants, taking detailed notes and diagrams. What they discovered would influence naval warfare for decades to come. The ability to launch aircraft from a submarine was a radical concept, one that would later inspire the development of missile-launching subs during the Cold War. Yet, even as the Americans studied their prize, a new problem emerged. The Soviets wanted a share of the technology. Under Allied agreements, they had the right to examine captured Japanese weapons, and they were eager to get their hands on the I-400s. For the United States, this was unacceptable. The Cold War was already brewing, and sharing such advanced designs with a future rival was out of the question. Thus, a secret decision was made. Rather than risk these vessels falling into Soviet hands, the U.S. Navy planned to erase them from existence. The captured submarines were quietly prepared for their final voyage, not as weapons of war, but as secrets to be buried forever. The captured I-400 Class Submarines, once the pride of Japan's naval innovation, were now under tight American control. They were towed to Pearl Harbor, where naval engineers dissected every feature with awe and curiosity. Each mechanism, from the folding wing bombers to the catapult launch system, was carefully studied. These massive underwater aircraft carriers were unlike anything the Allies had imagined during the war. They weren't just submarines. They were floating air bases, capable of striking deep behind enemy lines. For the U.S. Navy, this discovery was both a triumph and a concern. The Cold War was emerging, and with it came a new geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union. Under international agreements, the Soviets had the right to inspect captured Japanese technology, including the I-400s. The Americans, however, were not willing to share this treasure. They knew these submarines held secrets that could alter future naval warfare. To prevent this advanced technology from falling into Soviet hands, the United States made a secret and decisive move. The captured submarines were loaded with classified equipment and sailed out under the guise of training exercises. In reality, they were being taken to their final resting place, the deep waters off Hawaii. Once far from prying eyes, the U.S. Navy prepared the vessels for scuttling. Explosive charges were carefully placed, and torpedoes were readied. On the surface, the ocean was calm, but beneath, history was about to sink forever. With the final command, the charges were detonated. The submarines shuddered as explosions tore through their steel hulls. Seawater rushed in, dragging the giants down into the darkness. One by one, the I-400 Class submarines disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only bubbles and ripples on the surface. Within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by the Pacific, their secrets buried with them. For the American sailors who witnessed this, there was a mix of awe and sadness. They had destroyed something extraordinary, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. These vessels, once designed to bring death, were now victims of the very war they had failed to influence. Back in Japan, few knew the true fate of the submarines. Rumors spread among the surviving naval officers. But the reality was even more painful. Their most advanced weapons had been erased without ever achieving their purpose. The I-400 South had been envisioned as the instruments of a bold counterstrike, capable of changing the war's course. Instead, they became symbols of Japan's desperate last gamble and its ultimate failure. Even in defeat, however, the submarines left a legacy. The U.S. engineers who studied them recognized their revolutionary design. The concept of launching weapons, whether aircraft or missiles, from beneath the waves fascinated military strategists. In the decades that followed, the knowledge gained from the I-400s contributed to the development of ballistic missile submarines, which became a cornerstone of naval power during the Cold War. For Japan, the loss of the I-400s was the final chapter in a war filled with missed opportunities. The submarines had been a bold idea, but they were conceived too late and deployed too slowly. By the time they were ready, the war had already been decided. No weapon, no matter how advanced, could have reversed the tide. Years later, divers discovered the wrecks of these giants resting silently on the ocean floor. Their steel hulls, now covered in marine life, stood as monuments to a war long past. Looking at them today, one can only imagine what might have been had they sailed earlier, had they launched their bombers, had they struck the Panama Canal as planned. Yet history is not shaped by what-ifs. The I-400s, for all their power, became relics of a lost cause. They remind us that technology alone cannot win a war. Strategy, timing, and the will of nations decide the outcome. For military historians and enthusiasts, the story of these submarines remains captivating. They were weapons ahead of their time, conceived in desperation, built with brilliance, and lost to the depths before their potential could ever be realized. Their destruction was not just the end of a weapon. It was the end of an idea, a vision of warfare where stealthy giants could change the course of history. Instead, they became silent witnesses, lying beneath the waves, whispering the story of a nation's final hope. The I-400 Class submarines ended their journey not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet crash of waves over their sunken hulls. Their story, however, did not end with their destruction. Instead, it lived on etched into naval history as a tale of ambition, ingenuity, and the unforgiving realities of war. For Japan, these vessels symbolized both hope and desperation. Conceived during the darkest days of the conflict, they embodied the belief that a single daring strike could reverse the tide. The original plan, an audacious attack on the Panama Canal, was nothing short of breathtaking in its ambition. Had it succeeded, it might have crippled the United States' ability to move warships between oceans, buying Japan precious time. But war is not shaped by intentions alone. It is shaped by timing, resources, and the relentless march of events. By the time the I-400s were ready to sail, the Allies had already seized control of the Pacific. Island by island, they had pushed closer to Japan, cutting off supply lines and dominating the skies. Even the modified mission to strike the American fleet at Ulithi Atoll came too late. The U.S. Navy had already dispersed its forces, leaving the submarines without a target. Their bombers remained unused, their catapults silent. When they finally surfaced under American guns and surrendered, the war had effectively ended. For the Japanese sailors aboard, surrender was a bitter act. They had trained for a mission they would never carry out, and now they were handing over their country's last great weapon to the enemy. Their faces, worn and weary, reflected the collapse of an empire that once believed it could rule the Pacific. The U.S. Navy was stunned by what it had captured. The submarines were massive, longer than any they had ever seen, and their ability to launch aircraft while submerged was revolutionary. To American engineers, it was as if they had glimpsed a future of naval warfare. Every detail was studied: the folding wing bombers, the hangar systems, the launch mechanisms. Yet this was not just an engineering curiosity. It was a glimpse into Japan's wartime mindset. The I-400s were proof of how far Japan was willing to push the boundaries of technology to survive. They were also a warning. In future wars, innovation could come from unexpected places. But the end of the war brought new tensions. The Soviet Union, as an allied power, had the right to inspect captured Japanese weapons. The United States, already wary of its former ally, had no intention of letting such technology fall into Soviet hands. The decision was made. The submarines had to disappear. In a top-secret operation, the I-400s were sailed to deep waters off Hawaii. There, under the watchful eyes of American crews, they were scuttled. Explosives ripped through their hulls, and the giants sank quickly, swallowed by the Pacific. Their secrets went with them, denied to the world, except for the lessons quietly absorbed by the U.S. Navy. As the Cold War heated up, those lessons bore fruit. The concept of launching weapons from submarines evolved, leading to the creation of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submachines that could deliver destruction from beneath the waves. In an ironic twist, Japan's last great innovation helped shape the naval balance of power for decades to come. For decades, the wrecks of the I-400s lay undisturbed in the darkness, forgotten by all but a few historians. Then, in the 21st century, exploration teams rediscovered them, resting silently on the ocean floor. Their rusting hulls, covered in marine growth, still told a story of a time when nations gambled everything on technology. And when a single idea had the power to terrify even the mightiest navy on Earth, today, the story of the I-400 Class Submarines continues to captivate. They were weapons that promised to change history, yet never fired a shot. They remind us of the thin line between genius and futility, between innovation and desperation. In war, even the most advanced weapon can fail if it arrives too late. The I-400s were born from ambition, powered by ingenuity, and doomed by circumstance. They never struck the Panama Canal. They never attacked Ulithi. They never launched their bombers. But they left behind something far more enduring than destruction: a lesson in the unpredictable nature of warfare. Technology can win battles, but only when matched with timing, strategy, and the will to endure. The I-400s were a testament to Japan's relentless drive to fight against impossible odds. And though they failed to alter the outcome of the war, their shadow still stretches across history. Beneath the waves, these giants rest as silent witnesses to a conflict that reshaped the world. Their steel bones may rust, but their legacy remains, reminding us that even the most powerful weapons can become nothing more than relics, whispering stories from the deep.